They thought he was a freak and handicapped, but he would show them just how powerful he was. Yeah, his hands could have been used for good and could have continued the good name of the family business, but he chose a different path, an abusive, violent path, and because of this, he became hated in his community. He had done awful things and had not been held accountable. And because of this, his overinflated ego had created blind spots for the people coming for him, people who would have their justice one way or another, no matter the cost. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for being a part of my little podcast today. Was the intro kind of vague today? Yeah, a little bit. I do my best not to give away the whole story in 12 seconds, so sometimes it has to be a little ambiguous. And hey, if you're a new listener to this podcast, please subscribe where you are listening right now so that you can quickly and easily find 10-Minute Murder again when you want to listen. You can also connect with the podcast on social media. Links for that are in the show notes of this episode, or you can type 10-Minute Murder into the search of any of those social media platforms and you'll see it. Now, I'm going to be using a term today that may not be common to you, ectrodactyly. If you aren't familiar, you should definitely visit 10-Minute Murder on one of those social media sites and see the photos of what I'm talking about. It's a physical deformation that plays a pretty big role in the story today. And before I get going with the story, let me make it clear that I'm going to be using the terms freak and freak show as it relates to this physical disability, and not as a slight or a put down, but because the person we're talking about today was heavily involved in what used to be called freak shows. And freak shows sometimes traveled along with the circus. They don't call it that now because obviously it's super offensive, and you'll understand more once you hear the story, but I just wanted to make sure that you know that I'm just simply telling the story and no offense is meant by using the terms that can now be considered derogatory. Cool? Okay, let's get to it. Grady Stiles Jr. was born in Pittsburgh in 1937, and with a very peculiar condition. Some would worry that a child born with malformed appendages would be doomed in the 1930s. What would society think? How would people treat him as he grew up? Luckily for Grady, he was born into the perfect family, and he found himself not the least bit alone in what others might have considered a scary abnormality. Grady's father was already part of the literal freak show circuit, which is what they called it back in those times. He had a condition explained as a peculiar physical condition known as ectrodactyly, a rare congenital deformity that makes his hands look like lobster claws, as the middle fingers were either missing or seemingly fused to the thumb and pinky. And as we all know, people who are not considered normal are treated poorly and even horrendously bullied, and being born in the 1930s was an even worse set of circumstances. But to Grady's family, being born with this peculiar condition was an opportunity. As far back as the 1800s, as the Stiles family grew and produced more children with unusual hands, they in turn developed a circus, the Lobster family, which became a carnival staple throughout the early 20th century. The Stiles family capitalized on their uniqueness and turned it into a special gift that kept on giving in the form of earned wages as they toured with the carnival circuit and made anywhere between $50,000 to $80,000 per season. And unlike a lot of freak show acts, the Stiles didn't have to subject themselves to anything more than just curious stares. They were about to cash in even more with Grady, because up until this point, the Stiles family members that were born with ectrodactyly were only affected with their hands. For Grady, though, both of his hands and his feet were affected, and thus all four were shaped like lobster claws. Because of Grady's severe ectrodactyly, he couldn't walk around for himself, and he was confined to a wheelchair. And although he was seemingly impaired by this affliction, Grady found ways around it. He learned to use his upper body to pull himself across the floor with pretty impressive strength. As Grady grew up, he became alarmingly strong. As Grady continued to become fully immersed in the carnival world, he met another carnival worker that was tolerant and accepting of his ectrodactyly and fell in love with a young woman. Her name was Maria Teresa, and in the traditional way in which a person joins the circus, She had run away as a teenager. Maria and Grady were married and had multiple children, and when his son was born with ectrodactyly, as he was too, he was brought into the family freak show business of the carnival world. The Stiles had managed to create a vast opportunity for themselves, but it was around this time that their family history began to turn dark and violent. Grady drank a lot, and combined with his overpowering upper body strength, he became abusive toward his wife and children. One example of how violent Grady became, especially when he drank alcohol, involved Maria when he allegedly used his claw-like hand to rip his wife's IUD from within her body during a fight. Grady would also use his lobster claw hands to choke Maria, something that they were seemingly designed to do very well. The domestic violence continued to escalate to include other family members as well. Grady's daughter, Donna, had fallen in love with a man that her father did not approve of, and she was going to exercise her independence and go ahead and get married to the man anyway. What happened next is wide speculation, but the outcome was the same. Either Grady went to see his daughter's fiancé at his home or invited the young man over in the guise of giving his blessing for the wedding planned for the next day. However it began, on the eve of the wedding, Grady picked up a shotgun and murdered his daughter's fiancé in cold blood. Grady was arrested and scheduled to go on trial after having admitted his actions with no remorse whatsoever, but pointed out that he couldn't possibly be imprisoned. No jail could handle his disability, and confine him to prison would be cruel and unusual punishment. He also, by this time, had acquired liver cirrhosis from drinking and had emphysema from years of cigarette smoking. And unbelievably, the court realized that they had no counter-argument, as it was true that the prisons were not well equipped to deal with many disabilities, certainly not Stiles' incredibly rare one. So they let him off with 15 years of probation, and he returned home. As soon as Grady returned home, he resumed his domestic violence tendencies, now knowing that he could actually kill another human being and only receive probation. And during this time frame, Grady did his first wife, Maria, a huge favor and divorced her. He then married again and had 2 more children, all of whom were subjected to his drunken rages, and eventually his second wife divorced him as well. Then, for some reason no one could quite understand, Maria remarried Grady in 1989. Maybe she thought Grady had overcome his violent tendencies and would treat the whole family better, but no. Grady Stiles had evaded prison and gained a sense of being above the law, and thus the beatings became more severe. His wife finally reached her breaking point, and according to one of Maria's sons, Grady Stiles III, his mother and father engaged in another physical altercation, and Maria commented out loud that, quote, something needed to be done about her husband. One of the kids repeated that to the neighbor's kids, telling them that something had to be done. That neighbor kid agreed to help her do something, and in return, Maria paid this 17-year-old neighbor, Chris Wynant, $1,500 to kill Grady. Maria concocted the plan with one of her sons, and with the hired help in place, Chris took the .32 caliber Colt he had purchased from a friend with him into the Stiles trailer and shot Grady dead at point-blank range, finally ending the violence that the entire family had been enduring for far too long. Chris Wynant, Maria Stiles, and Glenn Stiles were all immediately apprehended and tried. But the interesting thing about their defense, it was a testament to the fact that the abuse was so bad that the Stiles family didn't even deny that they had intended to kill Grady Stiles. Additionally, Maria spoke at length during the trial of Grady's domestic violence history, but stating that, quote, my husband was going to kill my family. I believe that from the bottom of my heart. In the end, the jury convicted Chris Wynant of second-degree murder and sentenced him to 27 years in prison. Maria and Glenn Stiles were charged with first-degree murder and were sentenced to 12 years in prison. And as the trial was proceeding, Grady Stiles, who was killed by a plan created by 2 chronic domestic violence victims and a neighborhood boy, was buried. But in a small measure of justice that came back to pinch him in the end, the original Lobster boy was so disliked within the community that the funeral home could not find a single person willing to be a pallbearer. That's today's 10-minute murder, brief and bingeable true crime. Thank you for listening today, and as I mentioned at the beginning, be sure before you go that you subscribe to 10-Minute Murder, wherever you're listening right now. hit subscribe, and you will never miss another episode in the future of this podcast. It also makes it easier to find the podcast. You don't have to remember the name 10 Minute Murder. I mean, it's pretty simple to remember. But if you just happen to not remember it, you can just open your podcast app and boom, there it is. You don't have to remember it. It'll be right there with all the other episodes. Also, you can see the visuals that go along with the episodes that you hear me talking about here if you connect with 10 Minute Murder on social media. I post photos on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can go there, follow the podcast, and see all of that. I don't post graphic photos, like crime scene photos that are all bloody and gory. I don't personally want to see that myself because I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I'm subject to nightmares. Like I'll get nightmares if I see too much of that gory stuff, which is weird being a guy that does a podcast about murder. And some of these episodes, even if I don't look at the photos, they give me nightmares. But I don't post that because I assume that you don't want to see it either. If you do, you can go and DuckDuckGo, Ask Jeeves, or Google, whatever it is that you use. You can find it yourself and torture your own eyeballs. That's your business. But I don't post that on there because I don't want to get banned and I don't like nightmares. Links for that are in the show notes of this episode. And lastly, before we go, if you have friends you think they might be into brief true crime stories like the one you heard today, be sure to let them know about 10 Minute Murder. Thanks for listening. Be safe and make good choices.